Welcome back to Just Homebrew. This video is part 2 of a collaboration series I have with the Beer Junkies. We're going to sit down and compare the Kolsch I brewed to the Kolsch he serves in his brewery. He's also going to answer some questions that came up during my brew day, so stay tuned. So welcome, Brady, to Just Homebrew. Before we get started, I just want to say it's been a blast working with you over the past few months. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers are going to get a lot out of this collaboration. If you haven't already, check out part 1 of this series that captured my brew day, and also make sure to visit the Beer Junkies channel where I found this Kolsch recipe. It's been a long time coming, and I'm finally excited that we're sitting down and we're going to compare the beer I sent you and the beer I sent me. Why don't you kick off this taste testing and walk me through what your customers expect when they order a Kolsch and how my beer compares to the beer you serve at your brewery?
Sure. I'm very excited to try this. All these recipes that I've been developing, I'm assuming that they scale down as well as I'm hoping. So I'm very excited to see if it actually does scale down. So for the Kolsch, what we tell our customers is we want something that is dry and crisp, but we don't want it to be biting or harsh. So it's got a decent amount of bitterness that's going to linger into the aftertaste, but it has a delicate malt flavor that is going to accompany that hot bitterness. So I'm excited to try all 3 of these. We've got the 2 that you brewed, John. We've got the Viking and then the WLP029 yeast, which is what we use from White Labs. So we get to see the variations between these 2 different yeast strains with the same base. And then we have the third one, which is a growler of the Kolsch that I brew on our 7-barrel system. So I will go ahead and pour all 3 of these, make sure I keep them all in the right order. We've got the Viking on the left. I'll do that one first. I've got great carbonation.
And while you're doing that, I'm going to pour the beer you sent me.
Okay. White Labs. So up to the camera, this is your Kolsch, and then this is our Kolsch. They are both very, very similar in color. They both have similar amounts of carbonation. Your head retention is excellent. For the aromas on yours, I think I get some more of the malt coming through. It smells, get the malty sweetness. In mine, I get a little bit more of the Saz hops, and I think I expect that a little bit with the utilization differences. The aroma on the 2 different yeast strains is very similar. But those are close. They're close. I like those. The yours has a really nice malt flavor that lingers into the aftertaste.
I'm having a tough time here. I'm having a tough time distinguishing the 2. There's a little slightly different smell. You're right, a little more maltiness in mine, you were saying?
Yeah. That's the main difference that I'm getting, and that's kind of what I thought might happen, is your malt flavor is excellent. And I think the only difference is that sometimes on the bigger boiling systems, that like the 7-barrel system that we got, the hop utilization is greater. So simply scaling down the IBU based on IBUs, like the same percentages of everything, your utilization will be slightly lower than the utilization that I get. So my hops will come through a little bit more than yours might. And I think that's really the only difference. I can tell the water profile is nice because it's got a well-rounded flavor. I wouldn't say the hops are too accentuated or there's too much sweetness from the chlorides. It's very well balanced. And I'm surprised that I don't notice more of a difference between your two yeast strains. I think they're very similar.
I felt the Viking was a little bit bolder. It was a little bit more pronounced with, I would say, the malts. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but there was definitely a rounder taste with the Viking.
Yeah, I would say I get more flavor into the aftertaste with the Kvike.
Is it Viking or Kvike? Am I saying that right?
I think it's both.
Okay.
I think Kvike yeast is one of the strains, but Viking is also one of the brands.
I tell you what, so far this is a super success. I was really interested to see how much a difference this would be, but it's very, very close.
Yeah, that's delicious. Yeah, these are. I'm thrilled to say that we can scale them down. I'm glad that I'm not lying on my channel. I'm glad that these are very, very similar.
All right. Well, so the taste testing, thinking about, I did brew on an Electric Herms setup. So, I mean, I guess we could also compare. I also brew an all grain setup with a simple gas setup, so there's other opportunities to see if this could be a similar brew with other systems. But, as far as what I'm thinking about when I brewed during the brew day, there were some things that stood out to me that I had some questions for you. I thought we could cover them during this taste testing. And one question I wanted to ask was specifically about the salts and really creating the water profile. As you know, this is the first time I created a water profile, so I was a little nervous. I really didn't know what to expect. And the very first thing I noticed when I started measuring the salts, my scale was not that accurate. And I found myself eyeballing a little bit where I had to measure with a tenth and hundredths of a gram. So could you talk to a little bit what to expect if you overshoot salts or you undershoot salts? I'm sure there's all sorts of things that could happen, but at a very high level, what could I expect if I added too much salt to this brew?
Sure. So you were kind of in a good spot to be slightly guesstimating since you were using the reverse osmosis filtration system because you were starting with zero of everything. If you did add a little bit too much, it wouldn't have been the worst thing. But if you were to add too much sulfates, for example, that would really accentuate the hop bitterness. And then too much sulfate can lead to a harsh, unpleasant flavor. If you add too much of the chlorides, which is from calcium chloride is typically what you add for the chlorides, it can be too sweet to the point where it's cloying. So the other main ion that you want to focus on is calcium. And as long as you're within the 50 to 100 parts per million range, that's okay. There's not really an optimal, like 50 versus 100 won't really do much of a difference for you. It just helps reduce the pH slightly to the mashing pH and then helps precipitate some things out of the solution that are helpful later on in the process. But thankfully, you didn't add too much sulfate because you could tell. You'd be able to tell if it was harsh. And then you didn't add too much chloride because it's not sickly sweet. And then you didn't add anything that would have added magnesium. Too much magnesium is harmful for yeast health. And then what's the other one? No bicarbonates that would have raised the pH too high, which you also can tell it wasn't astringent.
Excellent. Well, staying on the same subject, I also ran into something where when I was adding and mixing the salts to my hot liquor tank, I noticed when I transferred the water to when I started the batch sparge, I had some salts left over. And I was thinking at a commercial level, how do you go about making sure all these salts are mixed in during the mash process so you're not leaving any salts behind?
Sure. So I don't have a really fancy system with the water profile. So what I usually do is I'll pull off our reverse osmosis filtered water, and then I will pour the salts into that and pre-mix it beforehand. So I'll stir it in with a mixer and then visually inspect it to make sure, because sometimes the gypsum salt in particular will clump up and won't really mix very well. So I'll stir it for a couple of minutes and then make sure that there aren't any clumps. And then I'll pour it directly into the mash tun and stir it additionally in there. And then we recirculate via pump. So I will let that recirculate for an additional couple of minutes and then visually inspect again to make sure that I don't see any remaining salt particles in there. And if there are, I would try and drain that bit off and then into a separate container, stir it some more, break up the clumps again, and then pour them right back in.
So same thing I would do at a smaller scale.
Yes.
That's good to know. Good to know. You know, a big part of this project is taking a recipe at a commercial level and scaling it down to a homebrewer's level. I don't know if you've released your book or not, but the past month you shared a book that you're writing, and it really talked about how to think about recipe design, about putting together different percentages of malts and hops. Could you just walk us through how you would think about scaling down a commercial recipe down to what we brewed for this Kolsch beer?
Sure. So I design my recipes mostly based off of the percentages and not necessarily the poundage. So the scaling is very easy for me. The only thing I was worried about was how close the taste that I'm expecting it to be on the big system is versus the small system. But for the percentages, I always start with the malts because that gives me the starting gravity and then the color and then some other things that I use for calculations. But from that starting gravity, I can go on and then calculate the hops based on a ratio called the bitterness to gravity ratio. And for the gravity, if you have a gravity of say 1048, I use the number 48, and then the bitterness. I'll give you an example right here. I've got written down. So if I have an original gravity of 1048 and I want an IBU to gravity ratio of 0.4, I would just multiply the two together and then get 19.2 IBUs to split amongst all hop additions. And I have more in-depth explanation of that ratio in the book that I'm writing, and I'm hoping to release that in the next week or two. So for designing all of my recipes, I use the software that a lot of people use actually, which is Beersmith, which is very helpful because it will calculate all of the things that you need, the starting gravity, the bitterness, the SRMs, all of that. And then I go based off of the percentages of the malts and not the hops. So for the malts, I know kind of going into the recipe, the percentage of base malts, the specialty malts that I want to use. And then I keep that within the gravity range of the beer style I'm going for. And whether I'm scaling to a 7-barrel system or scaling down to 5 gallons, that percentage stays the same. So whether it's 80% at 7 barrels, it's still going to be 80% on a 5-gallon batch. So that scaling is simple in that regard. And then even the hops kind of scale the same too, because the gravity is always going to be the same. The starting gravity should be the same for a 7-barrel beer versus a 5-gallon beer. And then I go based on that starting gravity, I calculate the IBUs based on a IBU to gravity ratio. So if the IBUs are 48 and the gravity is 48, 1048, the two cancel out to a 1. So that would be your ratio for that. And I use that for every beer style. I have a list of approximate ratios for each beer style. Some like American wheat beers that are very low might be a 0.3, and then double IPAs that are very high might be a 1. So I use that to develop the hops, and then the yeast, the pitch rate is constant. It's 1 milliliter per degrees Plato per.
Oh, while you find that, I'm going to pour some more of your beer. Gotta save some for the chug.
For the yeast strain, it's about 500,000 cells per degree Plato per milliliter of wort. So you just scale that up. And then most of these yeast companies like Y Yeast and White Labs, they'll calculate the number of packages that you need based on your starting gravity and then the attenuation that you want. And then the water profile, that's based entirely on the volume of your mash tun and your sparge water. And then I use the software called Brewing Water, BRU''N, water, and it's a free software that you can download, and it lets you input your grain bill because the SRM of your beer will kind of change the water profile that you want, and then you can adjust the salts, and it will calculate for you the parts per million of all the ions that we just previously mentioned, that the calcium, the magnesium, the sodium, the sulfates, and the chlorides, and that the water profile is really what makes the difference in these beers. But to answer your question, the scaling it's really not too bad. It's just as long as you use a software that calculates it for you and you don't have to write it out by hand, it's just percentage based.
Well, Brady, this has been a great project. I had a lot of fun. Make sure to check out Brady's channel, the Beer Junkies, and also the book that he has that's going to be released in the next few weeks. So, Brady, why don't you take us home with the chug? I have a beer ready to go here.
All right, me too. We're over the age of 21. We do not condone underage drinking. Please drink responsibly.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. That was really good.